Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. Shop Talk, if this is your first time here, welcome. This is a way for us to kick back and relax after a long day. In my case, it was a long day driving back from Jacksonville, but for many people, it would be a long day working, doing work-related stuff. Speaking of people who do work-related stuff, we've got Mala over here. How you doing, Mala?
Doing excellent. Thank you. Hello, everyone.
All right. And if this is your first time with Shop Talk, this is chat driven. So chat, drive away. If you have any questions, drop them in. We'll talk about them. We did get a question in the Shop Talk email address, which, by the way, if you've never seen it before, is shoptalk@tripass.org. If you look down at the bottom of your screen, you may see it right now. So the question came in and basically said, hey, I've taken over database tasks at the company I work at, and there are a few different ways that they run SQL code, things like integration services, packages, SQL agent jobs, uh, stored procedures, ad hoc code, executing triggers. There's a lot of different ways to make changes to the underlying data. And there's some table that's getting updated and just don't know where the process that's updating it is coming from. Not sure what that thing is which is performing the update. So the question was, is there a way to see where and how a database object is being manipulated and then be able to go and modify that code? So the person also wants to avoid third-party tools and thought, hey, maybe something like SQL Server Profiler could be an answer. Now, my recommendation on here first is, as far as Profiler goes, I'm in the I don't like Profiler much camp. This is not 2012. This is in fact the year 2023. I had to look down at my clock to make sure. At the very least, it's March of 2020, but I think we're in 2023 at this point. So, moral of the story: their extended events has been the better solution for over a decade at this point.
hmm
And if you're of the mindset that Profiler is good enough for me and I'm never going to change it, I'd say give extended events an extended try. There's no pun intended in there, but more than just I clicked it, I don't like the UI, and then close it and pretend that you never did anything. Because I'll let you know a secret. Profiler's UI also sucks. It actually sucks more. It's just that you're used to it. You spent so many years embracing the suck that you don't even see how awful it is. Trust me, it's a bad UI. Now, this really wasn't intended to be a rag on Profiler response, although I'm going to rag on Profiler a bit. Because actually, my answer isn't even to use extended events necessarily. You can use extended events to track when a procedure executes or something happens. You can sort of track code executions, look for particular bit of code in a SQL statement that executes that maybe includes your table that you're looking for. But there's a better way to do it. And that better way is something that our own Mark Gordon presented on a while back, and that is to use something called SQL Audit. So SQL Audit is the ability for us to track at an instance level or at a database level certain operations. And those operations can include things like insert, update, and delete on a table. So I've got here a Stack Exchange question and answer from Nick Kane. And if I bring this up on screen, we'll talk about it just a little bit. So let's
Kevin, it
check.
might help if you put up the whole question that person had to before we get started with this so that our audience would know what we're talking
Well, I gave the fluff answer because the full answer is really just in email.
about.
So
Okay. Uh-huh.
didn't want to share too much of my email that might scare
No,
young children.
no, that's fair enough.
So using extended events for tracking an update to a table. That was the question from here. It was basically, hey, I'm trying to track updates to this table, which tracks very well with what the writer requested. And Eric Cobb's question had a couple of questions here of like, hey, should I be using something instead of extended events? And Nick's answer was, well, use SQL Audit, which if you're on any edition newer than 2016 SP1, you're going to get SQL Audit in every version, every edition of SQL Server. So Standard Edition, Developer Edition, Web Edition, Express Edition, you can use SQL Audit as long as it's SQL Server 2016 SP1 or later. And if you do use SQL Audit, you can create a server level audit, write it out to a file, create a database audit specification on your server level audit, tracking inserts and updates to that table. Or if you're tracking deletes, you could obviously add delete on object, and turn on your audit, and then be able to track the audit results. So tracking the audit results is querying a function fn get audit file, where you could pass in specific files if you know the names, or just say null. And it gives you back quite a bit of information, including stuff like the application name. So you can learn, was it Entity Framework that was doing this? Was it a SQL agent job or a maintenance plan? Was it something like Management Studio where somebody is updating this manually? The mashup engine, which means Power BI. So you get an idea of, based on the application name, at least what's causing the update. And then if it's code-based, if you have applied application names in your connection strings, you can know exactly which app is doing it. Most of the time, though, people don't put application names in their connection strings. So, and I'm bringing this up right now to see, okay, how do you add an application name into a connection string? And is that Martin Catherall? Yes, it is. Okay, Martin Catherall has a blog post about it. It's just as simple as this. Here's your connection string. You add an attribute, application space name equals, and then whatever the name of the app is. By doing this, and you're going to be able to separate out this app versus that app versus that app. So if you have multiple applications in your corporate environment that you care about, and most companies do, then you can separate which operations are happening from which app. This is especially important if you have multiple applications which write to the same databases. So then you can see, is one of them not behaving nicely? You can also use this application name in things like SP who is active. So that'll tell you, where is this coming from? By default, if you're running like a .NET app and you don't have an application name, it's going to give you some .NET SQL client provider, something like that, or SQL provider client. But if you set the app name, it'll tell you, oh, this is my mainline application, or this is my admin portal, or something like that. So it's whatever you want to name it. Actually, yeah, Martin has it right here. .NET SQL Client Data Provider. That's what shows up by default if you're using a .NET app and you don't set an application name. So it's really easy to do. And then when you query the audit file, you're able to see, oh, this was the app that caused it. Now, even if you don't set those connection strings, you're still going to be able to get some amount of information from this application name. You may also get a client IP address. I've noticed that that is sometimes accessible, sometimes not interesting at all. So there, you might find some relevant information there, but don't count on it. Still, you can also see like what was the database principal, so which database user performed this operation. And that way, if you see something like Management Studio and then this database user, then you'll get an idea, well, who has the ability to run as that database user, and talk to the person and say, hey, you were running a script in Management Studio that updated this table. Can we talk about it some more? So this is going to be your best bet for sorting out who or what is modifying a particular table. And I highly recommend watching Mark's video on the topic. It's something that we've had up on the TriPass YouTube channel for quite a while. And a little behind the scenes analytics, it is actually the most popular YouTube video that we have for TriPass presentations. So Mark gets the grand prize for that one.
Mm.
But that is probably the easiest way to sort out this kind of a problem where I want to track who or what is updating a particular table or a set of tables.
Mm-hmm.
And
What's the footprint for the audit, though, Kevin? I've never used it. I know about it, but I'm sure that it has a footprint, right?
there can be a footprint. So there are ways to minimize that footprint. Like for example, setting a queue delay
Uh-huh.
will say sort of like query store where all right, hold these messages for a certain amount of time and then flush them out as a batch versus
Uh-huh.
try to write each one. If
Uh-huh.
your underlying disk is slow,
Mm.
you may end up having performance problems, especially if you're writing your audit file to disk, which
Mm.
generally you want to do. So if
Mm.
you're creating these auditing files, yeah, I want to write them to disk. I want that disk to be as fast as possible. I may set rollover files where the idea is I want this file to be no more than 10 megabytes. And then I'm going to
Mm.
create 1,000 rollover files. So there will be
Mm.
up to 1,000 files, and then we're going to reset and start from file number one again.
Mm.
And so any audit performance wise is going to be just a function of how many audit events does it need to write out,
Mm.
because you would imagine if I audit on every select statement on an extremely busy server,
Mm.
there can be a fairly significant overhead.
Yeah.
That would be where you'd need to have some extra resources. Transactions don't get paused while waiting for an audit to be written out.
Mm.
Certainly not if you have a queue delay on. So it's
Mm.
not like that, but it'd be more
Mm.
like if your audit process itself is taking up resources. Say your audit files are on the same drive as the NDF and LDF and MDF files.
Mm.
So if that's the case, first you run a risk of running out of disk space, and that's kind of a bad thing. Second, you run the risk of chewing up all of your disk bandwidth, I guess I would call it, and
Mm.
not being able to make full use of what SQL Server can do for reading and writing to your database files.
Mm.
But still, if you keep that audit sane, if you're auditing things that don't happen very frequently, then there's effectively no realistic overhead.
Mm.
It's not that big. If you're
Mm.
auditing extremely common events, then yeah, there's a bit more overhead. It's not going to audit, it's not going to save things like the query plan. So
Mm.
you don't have to worry about extremely large query plans getting written out to disk.
Mm.
The per record size could be a little bit large if you have a lot of ad hoc SQL queries, because it'll save the first 4,000 characters of the T-SQL query.
Mm.
So if you have a lot of those ad hoc queries, there's a chance that you'll have some extra noise. But
Mm.
as far as practical performance considerations, not an enormous deal.
Mm.
So it's the type of thing that be fairly smart about it, and you're probably never going to notice it.
Mm.
Be really dumb about it, and you probably will notice it.
Mm.
So that was our first topic. Very helpful. Thank you so much. Excellent. And welcome in, Crazy Coconut Kill. Glad to see you here. So I will also follow up with the original questioner just in case that person's not here tonight. And but yeah, that's the way to do it. So second, we were talking a little bit in the last few days, doing some show prep, which amazingly does happen. It's weird. We don't look this polished and practiced by doing nothing. We spend literally minutes preparing. But we're having a little chat, little conversation about a different topic that hopefully Tracy will be back next time and she'll talk about it, vent about it a little. And it got us talking about this notion of entity attribute value tables. And I had to drop a link to my favorite article ever on the topic. Comes from Phil Factor. It's 15 years old and has to do with this notion of entity attribute value. Now,
He's so awesome. He's somebody I've never met, but I really love his articles because they're so brilliant.
or at least that you don't know that you've ever met.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Oh,
that's the
now
funny thing
you're
about Phil
intriguing me,
is
Kevin. Okay.
I don't know that I've met him before. So I can't tell you that either way. But he's a very anonymous type of fellow. But it is funny listening to his description of himself as a very dumb looking man. So people underestimate him all the time. And they're willing to say what they've actually believed because they don't think he understands it. And then it gives him a practical
How
advantage.
do you say that to someone? I don't know. I don't
Oh,
want
he
to
wrote it
distract.
about himself.
Oh,
And
really?
yeah. Like I said, I've never seen him. This is his self description and a little tongue in cheek. So I'm going to share this next bit about entity attribute value. This is a table design, which Phil's article. I love this article. This is a short essay. I highly recommend reading it because he's a great writer. He hasn't done so much writing in the past few years, but there was actually a book that Redgate published, which was a series of essays from him, and totally worth it. So this article also calls the one true lookup syndrome or one true lookup table. Here's the general idea of entity attribute value. Think of a relational database. We have relations. What is a relation? A relation is, oh boy, I'm gonna do this. So we have a relation which is made up of a few elements, and I wonder if I'm gonna be able to draw on here. Can you see the box, Mala,
1 second. Can you see the box?
around the title? Red
No,
box.
no.
All right. Well, okay. So I can't draw on that. Maybe I can draw on here. Let's see if this works. Maybe not. All right. Well, I'm not going to do any drawing. Instead, I'm going to have to do talking and maybe hand gestures. So, a relation in set theory is this notion of a collection which has a header, and the header is made up of attributes. Each attribute has a data type, and we have a collection of tuples which are of the shape of that header. So they have the same collection of attributes and data types represented. So we have this set of rows at a particular point in time. That's the definition of a relation, or one definition of a relation. Now, when we start talking about relations, when we talk about tables, and we think about table design, we think in terms of columns. What are the columns that we want to have? Or in proper formal logic terms, what is the collection of attributes that we wish to see in the heading? What are the data types associated with those attributes? And as we're thinking about this, we have discussions with business people. We formulate what might fit. We look at what's already there. We try to plan out what this appropriate data model looks like, which reflects real life, while also hopefully following the rules of appropriate relational design. And we won't get too far into those appropriate relational design rules. That's a talk literally a talk. That's full 60 to 90 minutes of me rambling on. So we're not going to do that. Certainly not today. Unless somebody really wants it. And even then, we're probably still not going to do it. But we have this idea, and it's a lot of hard work. It's hard work for a data architect. It's hard work for a database developer, for an application developer, whoever's building out this database, to understand what is it that the business people need and what is the most appropriate way to store and maintain that information. So, what ends up happening is that eventually every person has this epiphany. And what Phil calls it here is one true lookup syndrome. So what happens is that we get a little fuzzy in the head and say, wait a minute. So I have, think about these tables that have all of these columns on them, and I have to define them out, and, stuff changes. The business users come back to me and say, well, we really need this instead of that. And I'd like this to be a little more flexible. Flexible is usually the key word that starts us down this path of madness, because I don't want to have to do quite as much work, and it's hard to change a database. In fairness, it is fairly hard to change a database once rules have ossified. It is much harder to change that than application code, which is much more ephemeral in nature. So, as a result, either we can put more effort and energy into putting the best decisions forward, or we could kick all that to the curb, and instead, what if I just had a table which listed all of my entities, and then a table that listed all of my attributes, the things that could be associated with an entity, and then a table which had, here is my entity, here is my attribute, here is my value. And this one goes even further and says you could have a text value or a numeric value. And then the application developer or whoever's feeling like, I'm the smartest man alive. I cannot believe that nobody else has ever thought of this, but I guess it makes sense because, as stated at the beginning, I am the smartest man alive. And so they put this out, and it works beautifully in the development environment. Like, yeah, business person, oh, so you want to have a new attribute associated with the solid state drives? Oh, come at it. I'll just add a new attribute. Then we can add these values. Oh, you want to get some other information? Beautiful. I'll just add it. And then you want to see the results of this query. Okay, well, all I have to do is select all the stuff for instance ID 1, and then that'll give you like a set of rows back. But then the person says, yeah, but what I really want is my columns. I want to see like the capacity and the endurance, and additional things here might be SLC, DLC, TLC, QLC. How many layers do I have? We might have other attributes about these drives. What form factor is it, et cetera, et cetera. And I just want that as a set of columns. I just want to see it back. And so the query to retrieve this data in a pivoted format involves some nastiness. Let's see if they actually implement what is the awful query for this. No, what they do is basically say, give me back all the results and then build it back in the application. But, no, I take it back. They do get to some of the nastiness. Okay, so we have our results, I guess. Joining to field, left joining to text values, and we're unioning and getting different numbers, and like what you end up with is a whole series of unnecessary self joins, or pivoting and summation and cases, and particularly nasty queries that do not perform well at all, especially once you get past 5 rows of data. Once you start getting into 10 million rows of data and you're trying to pivot this data and have it shaped like an appropriate result set, performance crawls. That's the common problem with entity attribute value. It is that it is very easy to get sucked into it. It is very easy to believe that you've solved the problem of databases. and thinking that databases are a problem as opposed to it's data collection as a way of thought. And it is an alluring strategy, but it ultimately fails to deliver on the promise that you have for it if you are expecting to get back the results in a format which most applications desire. Like if I gave you this information in Power BI or in Excel or as a result set in an application, a lot of people would just say, well, "Why can't I just have this in a grid? Why are you giving me this weird entity ID attribute ID combination? That's so strange." So the flexibility also ends up being a curse. In addition, because you don't have as much control over the data model. So I could add a new drive, a new entity here that does not have all of the necessary attributes. So there's no good way for us to define you must have these four attributes. You may or may not have this attribute. This attribute doesn't make sense at all for this type. So we're not able to define any of those types of rules in the data logic. Whereas if we built this out using appropriate data modeling, we would have, here is my header. My header has the attributes that are absolutely necessary for this entity. They have appropriate data types. In this case, we don't have appropriate data types. We have a text value and a numeric value. Well, what happens if neither the text value nor the numeric value is set? Do we have a default? Do we have a check constraint that returns an error? Do we just accept it? What happens if both are set? Do we have a check constraint that returns a failure if both are set? What happens if we go from one to the other? Is that okay? And then how do I bring these results back together? Well, we have to do like an is null. Check to see if text value is set. If so, use it. Otherwise, use numeric value. But then the result of that is everything's got to be a string coming out. So you've lost your numeric value. You've kind of converted it back to a string, which may have negative ramifications, like if you're trying to do string addition.
How can you also have constraints and things like that, Kevin, that are very specific? Like suppose I want the name for a certain entity to be just 10 characters and no more.
You really
How do
can't.
I? Yeah.
At best, if you have complex check constraints, you might be able to pull that off. Usually the response is, we'll do all of that in the application. And then my counter response is, you probably won't do it all in the application. And even if you do it all in the application, you won't do it in the next application. And even if you do it in the next application, it won't matter when a person goes in and updates it directly from Management Studio. So there's, by deferring any of those data quality checks to the application, which is not the gateway, you lose that capacity to perform appropriate validation. You also are counting on the validation that you've written to be appropriate and to be completely correct, that there are no edge cases which accidentally do something to the data or ignore a bad case because your developer just never thought of it. Like you did a check, is this a number? And somebody gave you 5x. Is that a number? No. X5. Is that a number? Maybe. Could be 0x5, so hex 5. Similarly, is 9a a number? Maybe. Depends on whether your numeric interpreter accepts hexadecimal inputs. And even within SQL Server, if you use things like isNumeric will return positive, like, yes, this is numeric for things that include the letter D, 0x whatever. It can include returning true for things that are not really numeric, but have all of the characters that are supported by the isNumeric check. So just because isNumeric returned true doesn't mean it's really a number. And then if you tried like try cast to make sure it's a number, that may give you back a number. It may give you back null, depending on how the interpretation of your totally numeric string gets handled between those two functions. But you also can't have, with any simplicity, rules like this attribute must be numeric. Yeah, you can have is numeric on this attribute here, but in order for you to apply that rule for certain, you have to have a trigger. So you're going across to a different table to make sure that the input attribute is in fact of the appropriate type. All in all, this ends up being not a total waste of time, but it is extremely alluring, and like the sirens, you will eventually crash against the shores if you use it. And so I guess my best advice for you is to have all of the rest of your application developers plug their ears with beeswax, and then lash yourself to the mast and try to get through this until you feel better. So usually good advice for a lot of things, especially if you're on an Odyssey. Just don't tell the other folks that you're on an Odyssey, because they're not going to survive. They don't have to know that, though, do they? So definitely recommend this article. Excellent article from Phil. I will say there are two cases when I think that this structure, or a modified version of this structure, can make sense. Case number one, Phil's example is actually proof of concept. I need to build something very quickly. Requirements are constantly changing. I just need to be able to demonstrate something to somebody. EAV is a viable technique for that. If you keep your data sizes very small, if you keep the entities and attributes rather simple, then you can get away with it. But that comes with the proviso that before you go from proof of concept to production, this thing's got to be rewritten. You have to use an appropriate data model. That's the risk. My big concern in life is, in so many cases, we go from, oh, I'm just doing this to get it out quickly and we'll fix it later, to 7 years later, hey, why do we have this awful design? Well, we just never had a chance to fix it. And a lot of times managers will say, look, let's just ship it and we'll fix it in V2. And then you find out V2 never arrives. It's there with Godot at the train station. So that's a significant risk. And eventually V2 forces its way on you, because you have a big customer with 1 million rows and all the queries are timing out, and corporate's looking at you like, well, we need to get this solved right now, so say goodbye to your family for a little while. And that's not a place we typically want to be in. That's use case one. If you know that it is actually a proof of concept, if you know that you can get away with throwing that code away and building it with the appropriate data model once that data model has solidified, then it's viable. But again, I'm always very concerned about the risk of you're not going to have the chance to fix the problem. At least not until it becomes a major problem. Option number two is if you never pivot. What I mean by that is, if I only return back the value table, and I could join it to attribute, I could join it to entity, that's okay. So value joined to attribute joined to entity. And I could say where entity ID equals 1 and return back all of the attributes. And if the application handles all of the searching, filtering, pivoting, all of those operations, then this EAV model is a viable solution. It is not a fantastic solution, but especially in a case where you have a lot of attributes that may be customer specific, and you really want to provide that level of flexibility that you're just not able to control for. There is no common set of criteria for a given customer, or you have a common set of criteria, but then you also have these optional criteria that you need to be able to support. An attribute style table can work as long as you're not counting on the database to try to pivot this together. So if you're just returning back a bundle of results from the database and you're not using it to really reshape a result set, okay, that's a reasonable alternative. And that is workable. I've seen it work in very large environments, hundreds of millions of attributes, and it works acceptably well. There are limitations to it. There are certainly problems where you're not going to have the same data quality. You run the risk of having, say, overlapping attributes in terms of concept. You may have a lack of specific data rules of how I can tell this is good data, this is bad data. You may drive Mala out of the room. I mean, this stuff does happen when you use entity attribute value. But it's a scenario where, that we can work with. The default, however, I would highly recommend as you build out your data model based on the specific requirements of the customer, not total flexibility of, well, the customer can get anything later on. This is where we have to understand the domain. And understanding the domain, that's a challenge of its own. There's a lot involved in it. It involves asking questions and talking to people, two things that I hate doing. But we just gotta roll with it sometimes.
I don't think you're as bad as you think you are at that, Kevin.
No, I'm worse. I just fake it reasonably well. So that was a little semi rant. I don't think that counted as a full rant, but counted at least as a semi rant on entity attribute value. And I think we've had enough of that for now. So next, final topic for the night. Assuming nobody has any questions in chat. Chat, you're there. So if you have any questions, get them in here and we'll talk about them. But last thing, I want to talk about a question that came up in conversation. And I'm not going to mention too much about the specific conversation. Those details don't matter. And really, this is kind of a tangent off of that conversation anyhow. So very rough idea. There's an anecdote of a person who was recently training a large cohort of people just out of college, various colleges across the world, a lot of people. All of them were computer science people and had backgrounds in development. And this person asked, hey, how many of you have database experience? Almost none of them had database experience. Absolutely none of them had experience with either SQL Server or Oracle. And so this was interesting and led to some discussion. But what I want to bring this to is a follow-on anecdote, and that is, I think it is very difficult to get people at colleges, mainly professors, actually interested in databases. I think a lot of
Why is that, Kevin? Why is that?
That's a good question, but I think a lot of computer science professors fall into one of two camps. Camp number one is the academic computer science professor. I am teaching the theory. And so databases are an implementation detail. So unless... Even if they're teaching a databases course, usually it's about relational theory, set theory. How would you build a database versus using databases? And I think the more academic the school you go to, the more likely you are to run into that kind of professor. The other group are the I'll call them the more practical development oriented, the business oriented professors. And for a lot of them, at least my experience, and in discussing with other people at different programs, usually those types of professors just want to give you a file. Okay, here's a file. Load the file up. And that way you don't have to worry about things like, will this work on the person's computer? Do the computer labs at the school have the appropriate software that they would need? If you have a shared service like a database and you have a bunch of students using a computer lab, stuff goes wacky. If you have individual laptops for all the students, then again, trying to get that software installed and get those databases prepared, there's a lot of extra work when I could just email you a file or I could put it on a share drive and you can grab that file and just read it. So I think that for a lot of students coming out of computer science programs, they're not really using databases. And so that leads to the question of, well, how much of a concern is this? And also, is this founded? I mean, I'm throwing out some anecdotes. That doesn't mean that this is large scale data. It's not necessarily applicable across the board. And I will also say there are programs which specialize in database administration, database development. Those tend to be more of the technical colleges. So here in the Triangle area, we've got Wake Tech, and Wake Tech has a database program where you can learn how to become a database administrator and database developer. As far as universities go, I don't think that there are those programs. I haven't looked so much at the curriculum for NC State or UNC or Duke or any of the other universities around here. I would not be shocked if the answer of how many database courses are there is either 0 or 1, but it's an academic course and not a practical implementation course. I wouldn't be shocked. But I don't know for sure. Still, if you're here in chat and you had a computer science or similar background, I am curious, did you have any database courses offered to you, and did you take them? I had one database course that was offered. I didn't take it, though. Kind of makes you wonder why I ended up in this field. But at the time, I forget why I didn't take it. I think it was that I wanted to take a different course that was offered at the same time. But that was the only course which I knew of which offered any access to relational databases. The rest of the computer science curriculum I had was all read files. Go read this file, go do work with it. And it sounds like the languages have changed, but a lot of the processes still remain the same. However, if anybody in chat wants to talk about their experiences, put it in there. I want to hear about it. And in the meantime, I also want to kind of poll for ideas of, well, what can or what should we do about this? We meaning data platform practitioners, people who go and talk about this thing. I mean, you're here at Shop Talk. You're probably at least somewhat interested in databases as an idea. And I am interested in hearing about, all right, well, is there a way to reduce that level of friction somehow, where college-age students are actually learning about this concept? Because they're eventually going to have to work with databases as part of a future job. And working with databases seems to be a skill that not all developers end up achieving. So building up some of those types of skills seems to be a worthwhile endeavor, but I'm at a loss for ideas of, well, how do we get there? You can put the content out, you can make the content available, the content can be free. That doesn't mean that people are going to see it. You can talk to professors. Most of the time, we don't get responses. You can teach the course, and maybe if you can find someplace with a curriculum that's willing to let you teach it. In most cases, you're going to need at least a master's degree,
Mm-hmm.
and even if you have one, that doesn't mean that they're going to be interested.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of cases, you'll be most likely able to teach at the community college or the technical school level
Mm-hmm.
versus the major university. So
Mm-hmm.
all of these high-end students who are coming out of the University of blah blah who've never seen a database, or at most, they worked with Firebase DB because they did a mobile application on Android. Well, that doesn't mean you know the first thing about using a database. And I am definitely interested in seeing what we can do to reduce the learning curve for people to understand that databases are important and here's how you learn about them.
That's a very intriguing question, Kevin. I'll take it back to a couple of the professors who I'm in school with and ask what they think. They are people who are pretty clueless about databases, by the way, and they like having me in the class because I'm the only technical person there. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes. I'll ask them next week and see what they say.
Yeah, and again, if anybody else has thoughts in chat, got something. So we did have database courses. I did not take it either. We used a database one time in software engineering at NC State. You're right; it was complex to set up and connect to the app we were developing, so we ended up using a library to perform SQL statements. We just parsed files typically. So yeah, I mean that sounds like the experience hasn't changed very much from 19 when I got my degree. Uh,
I
had to
did
use the
two courses on data analytics before I took up this job. Think it was a University of Davis, some Davis University. I forget the full name of the school even, but they were horrible. They were just horrible. The courses. I mean, they used some. I think they used MySQL then. But the database is designed for us to work on. I mean, I would pick up fights every week with the instructor. Like, this is poorly designed. You're making us do exercises on this and on this and that. Blah. Finally, the professor on top of this said, "I think it's best we offer you a refund because you clearly don't like this course." And you're saying that we've designed it poorly. So I'll offer you a full refund, even though you've taken 3 weeks of the classes. And then, you can leave us alone. I said, okay, I'll take it and I'm out of here. But what you're doing is wrong. So it went like really poorly. It went really, really poorly. Because the people who are teaching are not database familiar. They're just people messing around with Excel and doing some stuff somewhere. They have no idea of relational theory. They have no idea how tables are set up or any such thing, how to run queries. Yeah. Schools don't teach this kind of stuff at all very well.
right, and I
Mm,
think that is unfortunately a common experience, and
mhm,
it's also I keep harping on academic and business friendly as the bifurcation in the computer science world
mm,
because I think that bifurcation is there, it is real, and on the academic side, and it's not me sassing academician or academician computer scientists. I certainly appreciate a lot of what they bring on algorithms, on data, on data structures, but in algorithmic design and things like the theoretical approaches to relational theory, formal logic, graph theories, things along those lines.
mm.
But yeah, they're all atrocious at database design. Maybe the people who are teaching relational databases and set theory are perhaps a little bit better, but even then you can't tell for sure because in a lot of cases they don't have to do it. They don't have to deal with the practical ramifications of it or have to have that deep understanding. This is just one course out of four that this professor has to teach, and just happens to be the one on the workload that, we need to offer a databases course. You're available. Why don't you teach that course?
Mm.
And so rarely do you get a person who has that interest, who has that passion, who has that knowledge, and who is able to do the teaching. When you get into the practical, into the business world, I won't even call it the practical world because business is also in cloud cuckoo land, just in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
But when you get into that business world, at that point, then there's some subset of people who are willing to say, well, I don't know very much about databases and I want to come learn about it. And so I'm going to go to a user group meeting. I'm going to go to a SQL Saturday or buy some training from someplace. And
Mm.
that's fine. Those are good approaches. Those are good ways to learn more about it.
Mm.
Blog posts, books, essays, articles, Stack Overflow questions, trying things out on your own, running demos, whatever. Whatever that approach may be. In the professional world, if that's how you're going to learn, do it.
Mm-hmm.
For people who are pre professional, who are still in that college age and just don't know what they don't know,
Mm-hmm.
things get so much more difficult, and it feels like that a lot of academician computer scientists have this approach of, well, we're not teaching for people to use this in a business environment. We're teaching so that you can learn the algorithms and possibly teach the algorithms later. Some of the
Mm-hmm.
more business oriented people who are teaching those algorithms courses, yeah, they're trying to make it practical. They're trying to make it, here's how you would actually use this in practice. Here are examples of it. And that's fine. That's fine. Just, it does feel like there's this enormous gap in data, and that, well, data's difficult to learn. It's somewhat difficult to teach
Mm-hmm.
relative to application development. And so, that, ironically, it makes me say, I think it's more important to have that focus,
Mm-hmm.
that you can learn additional languages later on. Yeah, do have the algorithms courses, do have the data structures courses, do have the courses on structured programming, on object oriented or functional development, on whatever normal chain that you're talking about. But I think that there's a lot of room for growth for getting involved in the data space and at the university level, and I just don't know how to hit those people, and I also don't know what are the practical ramifications of it, because to me it seems like this has always been the case. So I'm not thinking, oh, relational databases are doomed because kids these days aren't learning about them. Like, kids over the past 30 years haven't been learning about them in college. Or any more than here's the academic theory. So it's not along those lines. It's
So one
definitely.
thought, Kevin, just before COVID, I've been looking into doing a master's in data science for years. Like it's almost six years now since my search started. Even before COVID, that's why I took up a master's in something totally different because I could not find anything in data science that was affordable or within a time range I wanted. Nothing. In the span of 3 years, like just this year, this course I was talking to you before we started talking, three or four different schools have now come up with courses that are 15 to 18 months long, $10,000 or under $10,000, and all doable online, just in a span of 2 to 3 years. So things change. I just want to say that, put that out as an example of how things can change over time based on how the market evolves and the demand for what is needed. So I personally believe that as people understand how important data is and how important it is to learn, it will change over time.
Yeah, And that is a good thing to see.
Mm-hmm.
Seeing more programs on data science, machine learning, artificial intelligence. Now, for all of those, I would also say most likely there's not going to be much in the way of database design, database theory, database
No, no,
practice.
no.
It'll be again, here are flat files. Here's a
Yeah.
stata file. Here's a pickle file. Here's some CSV dataset or Parquet file. And we want you to just read this and then do work with it. So it's all file based. So I think I take your point that there are adjustments, that there are market changes, and
Mm-hmm.
so we can see them. I still, it leaves me to wonder, what are the potential gains? I think I see what those potential gains are, but the practical, how do you actually effect that change?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you get universities to uh, incorporate databases into curricula? I think it's a difficult topic because, yeah, the setup's a pain, maintenance is a pain. You've got a bunch of unruly college students who, as soon as you give them a shared database, they're going to figure out, what can I do? How can I hack it? By hacking, I mean doing dumb stuff with it because you have permissions to update a table. So you got people who are going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with all students having laptops at this point, typically, life's a little easier because you can say, well, kids, you're running Docker containers. You're going to go pull this database in a container. And that might be
Mm-hmm.
part of the answer.
Mm.
All right, here's SQL Server Developer Edition. It's got the Wide World Importers database pre-created on it. You run this command to instantiate it. Go do whatever you need to do, and when you're done, blow it away and start over. And this might be a way to circumvent that challenge a little bit. But yeah, I feel like this is an area where there's
So
something.
have you actually met people who do data science who have no idea of how relational or SQL stuff works, Kevin? Is that
For
even possible?
sure. Oh yeah.
Oh, okay.
So
Like I don't mean experts, but like no idea kind of a thing.
yeah, as in I've hired people straight out of college who have zero practical experience with databases,
Wow.
despite having PhDs in computer science or master's degree in statistics. I've worked with people who do have those data science backgrounds and might be able to write a select statement, because those are not skills that you need to learn. You need to learn R, Python, or Java, or C Sharp, or C++, or Rust, or
I didn't realize it was that bad.
yeah. You can get a college degree in a computer science program and never have to work with a relational database.
No, computer science I understand. I didn't realize data science was like that.
Sure. Oh yeah. You could get, depending on the program. That may be a little harder, but depending on the program, I still believe it because you'll get flat files, you'll get Excel files, you'll get Parquet or whatever, and you're generating your results in a Jupyter notebook. So you'll use pandas to read this file and then do your analysis,
Mhm.
and just never have to work with a database in the middle. And even if you do, sometimes it'll be like, oh, here's SQLite, and instead of writing a SQL query, you could just run this function to insert a row.
Hmm.
So it is something that you can blissfully avoid if in many programs, even in the data science world, or especially in the statistics world, because if you have a stats degree, yeah, you're learning R, you're learning possibly learning Python, but you're not learning databases. And I want to probably have to noodle about it a little bit. Probably have to see, what possibly can be done, because it's more than just at the, well, I'm going to go to one university and I'm going to try to nudge my way into improving this program somehow. or I'm going to go teach a databases course at one school. I think it's a lot more than that. It's more of a question of what's missing, maybe understanding the why behind it more than I currently do, and is there a way to mitigate those issues? I don't think the answer is additional external training, because for college students, if it's not on the test, why am I worrying about it? So I think it would have to be more of an internal curriculum thing, or it's we pulled you out of college, you're now in the professional world, let's get you up and going as quickly as we can on practical database skills. Maybe that's an area where there could be assistance. But yeah, big open question for me. Something I'll have to think about over the next bit. And definitely interested in thoughts from people. So with that, we're at the top of the hour. So thank you for tuning in. Remember, tomorrow we have a hybrid session. Thomas Grosser is going to talk to us about scaling SQL Server in a most excellent way. It will be here in Durham, just up the street from me, actually, and also online. So if you happen not to be in the Triangle area, you can also catch it online. Next week, next Tuesday, we'll have our main meeting. It will be at Tech Systems down in Raleigh. Again, also hybrid, so you can catch it online. Our fourth Tuesday meeting is online only. But all of these, go check out meetup.com/tripass. And until we see each other, take care, everybody.